What's up, New Year's Eve nerds? We haven't done one of these in a bit, but apparently I got to do 10,000 steps a day or some such bet I lost. Anyways, let's meander around the park and talk about role-playing, shall we? So I was recently asked to talk about the older editions of our beloved game, to which I responded, which one? There's so many. First, we have to ask, of course, what is and is not as an edition. Like, is the Rick and Morty Dungeons and Dragons and the Stranger Things Dungeons and Dragons a separate edition? Or are they just the same thing with different wallpaper? I don't know. Depending upon who you ask, there's 6, 12, or 21 editions. So who knows? I think we're going by the classic, though. What did I think of each of the classic editions? Not like the Holmes Basic, the Roberts Blue Book, the Expanded Extravagant, just like the classic 0, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, right? So let's talk about 0 edition first. What did I like and dislike about 0 edition way back in the 1970s? What little I remember. Iconically, it's the size and just that initial, what is this? This is something different. I mean, that's like the first time you ever saw books that size for games, you know? And just that idea that amateur printing like that could happen, you know? It was the beginning of the whole punk zine momentum, but that was like the start. Just I'm making this in my house with my printer and using whatever's available to me at Quickie Mart. So that iconic white box, the iconic 3 books, the iconic, I have no idea what this is, trying to read through it. So just emotionally and iconically, you can't, that's it. It's just bam. You don't really need to know anything about it. What did I like about it? Other than it was, first. Well, it's hard to say what I liked or disliked about it because I remember so little, and none of us really got it back then in the 70s when we, a bunch of 7 and 8-year-olds trying to figure out this bizarre game. I remember that I thought, even back then, I thought there should be skills. I like racist class, but I always thought racist class should have a little more oomph. Like, being just dwarf was cool. I could be dwarf, but the fact that being dwarf, I'm only limited to like 5, 8 levels, while human wizard can outpace me. I always felt a little unfair. Thaco, I couldn't get Thaco at all back then. Now I'm like, oh, but back then I was like, it didn't make sense. A lot of the math in 0 edition didn't make sense. Like, okay, this has got to be lower the better, but this is higher the better, but this is percentile. Okay, yeah. I think, there's nothing I really love or hate about 0 edition. My first character was a human fighter with a sword named Sam. Sort of just the blueprint for every character I've played since then. Human, guy with spear, guy with sword, guy with wand, idiot with stick. But nobody really knew what we were doing. You just fumbled through and, there was chits, there was dice, there was figures. You bought things without really knowing what they were for, or what they did, or who these people are. There was constant, there's references to Greyhawk and Blackmore and NPCs like Rollbrear and Tensor, and you're like, who are these guys? So really, this is like, 0 edition is like the appetizer. This is like, here is the introduction to this weird, wacky, wonderful world. We're not really going to tell you anything. We're just going to hint at enough to lick your lips and get you interested for when we actually do make the next thing. And obviously, 0 edition is so iconic that it's constantly being, reprinted and regurgitated. I mean, most recently with the white box from basic expert. So there is some love to that. But there's also like the other things you had to have with Zero Edition. Like you had to have the outdoor adventure board game. So much of Zero Edition was basically the fantasy version of outdoor adventure. And you had to have chainmail if you wanted to do more massive combats. And even from the beginning, people were house ruling stuff because they just didn't understand it or just didn't agree with it. And Wizards felt like they got the shaft, man. Compared to the other two classes, you know. I don't even think, was Rogue in original? I don't think so. I think it was just Fighter, Cleric, Thief. Fighter, Cleric, Magic User. Your Thief was your Halfling. Then you had Elf, which was your Fighter, Thief, Fighter, Magic User type. And then you had Dwarf, who was just... Who was just Dwarf. But I always kind of liked that. I always thought they should do more with racist class. So then we have First Edition or Red Box or Advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition, whatever you want to call First Edition, right? This was the D&D most of us played in the 80s, starting from Red Box, Blue Box, Expert, going into AD&D First Edition. And you know, it really felt like, okay, now we get like everything we love about Dungeons and Dragons comes out of that First Edition, Red Box, Blue Box, Expert, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition golden age. That was the golden age. That was the one perfect moment. The early 80s, people were playing it, people were running it, it was growing, it was changing. Other games were getting created. We had superhero games, we had space games, we had robot games, you name it, everything was coming out. It was just a wackadoodle time. And at the core of it was just finally understanding that this thing was out there. We were playing it in high school. We were playing it, you know, every weekend at the park. We were playing it in people's houses. Every trope, stereotype, idea that Dungeons and Dragons is founded on comes out of that period of the... So it took what we already had and expanded upon it. You know, it started giving us some more options for classes, more options for races. It started giving us some more of like a guidebook of how to create adventures and publish adventures and make your own games and expand upon that additional initial kernels that, you know, Greyhawk, Blackmoor, Palace of the Vampire Queen gave us. We started to see who these names were. We got it. Okay, now we know who this Elminster is. We know who this Mordenkainen is. You know, it started giving us the classic worlds. And then, you know, things got a little crazy. And but yeah, I think First Edition, that's the golden moment. That's like, you know, the perfection of Dungeons and Dragons. That's when everybody got along, and that's where the explosion of role-playing really starts. The character I was playing at the time was a dwarf fighter and a human cleric. We were still in the weird math, like some things were low, some things were high. We still had percentile. We were now adding like subclasses and paraclasses and new races and new ways. And plus we had Dave Hargrave Ardoin stuff. Yeah. Then we go into second edition AD&D. And all the weirdness that came out of that, and the collapse of TSR, the beginnings of what would become the OGL. More independent game companies, more fads coming out of Dungeons and Dragons. Now we're going into the middle, into the late 80s and early 90s. The Eddition wars are starting. Other games are starting to fight for supremacy. Second Edition just gave us more splat books, more options, more skills. more individuality. Characters became more unique to the player. Plus the transition, and how they explain the transition with the Avatar trilogy going from, one to the next, and why everything was suddenly changing. Perfect. I mean, the Avatar trilogy as an adventure was awful, but the Avatar trilogy as an explanation, that was the most brilliant explanation. They've never quite done it as well as they did to explain why everything's different than with the Avatar trilogy. So yeah, this is my golden age. This is where I'm, meeting TJ Storm. These are my favorite D&D stories as a player, come from that time period. But yeah, then we get third and 3.5. So the first transition from the TSR days to the what would become Wizards of the Coast days. We get more established what the different realms are, the different personalities were. Skills are now hardcore built in. We got some new races, we got some new classes, we got some ways to rethink the game. And again, we've just got that expansion of that explosive popularity. Now we're going into the 90s, mid-90s. Most of us are in high school. We've got D&D clubs in high school. It's growing, it's changing. The edition wars are getting worse. Everybody has their own favorite thing. 3 for me was, wow, now everything lines up. All the math lines up. The dice, it's higher the better now. Percentile, damage rolls, everything just lined up perfectly. And then we got 3.5 and the Apocalypse Stones to explain the difference between 3 and 3.5. And that 3.5 was totally unnecessary, but it suddenly became the edition. Like everybody forgot about 3, and we were just always been playing 3.5. And that gives us, of course, the birth of the OGL, the whole Magic the Gathering Hasbro thing. Now we're in college. D&D is being replaced by other games like GURPS. Everything we love about D&D, we're finding games that do it better. Like I'm playing 3.5, but this game does it better. I'm playing 3.5, but this game does it better. We've got Rifts, we've got GURPS, we've got Vampire, we've got Cyberpunk. We've got all these iconic moments in the 90s that not only shape gaming as it is today and begin the new generation and begin the more separation between the angry old school and the accepting old school and the new school, but we also get the idea that other games can do D&D. Oh my God, I want a dog. Can do D&D better. And then it's just years and years of 3.5 from college on. Everything is 3.5. There's, or other games. There's 15 years with TJ playing 3 and 3.5. There's all these other times. And then 4 comes out. Now I liked 4. 4 had some really brilliant ideas. I like the skill system in 4. I think it was the best skill system they had, the skill creep idea. I like the battlefield control idea. It really, they tried to make characters feel individual, but in doing so, it sort of different, The thing is, I don't really remember any specific mechanic that I loved. Every version had something I liked, and every version had something that didn't work for me. But, was anybody really playing rules as written anyways? I don't know a single game that I played in my 40 some odd years where we were playing rules as written. There was always some house rule, some mispronunciation, some addition, some subtraction. Put a notch in your character, draw a card. We're using alternative criticals. We're using an alternate magic system. We're using classes from this third party. Yeah. Nobody was running rules as written in California. I can't speak for other places. I can only experience in the games I was playing with. So, and then we get 4th, and then that's when the veil is removed, and we see what Wizards of the Coast really is. And for a lot of us, that's the beginning of the end for Dungeons and Dragons. 4th definitely was not Dungeons and Dragons. It was a completely different game using that name. We've talked about that endlessly. So, yeah. And then during the 4th years, most of us was playing Pathfinder. And again, now we're discovering that there are other games that do D&D better. Pathfinder did D&D better than D&D until Pathfinder got ridiculous. And now we're seeing the beginning of like indie games really growing up. OGL games really growing and becoming a force to be reckoned with. And we're seeing Hasbro Wizards of the Coast begin to show its age, begin to show the chinks in the armor, begin to show us the Death Star of stupidity it would become. So I'm going to say 3 for me. Introduces classes I really like the Sorcerer. Really nailed home the skill system to make characters feel individual. Really nailed home the idea that subclasses, before they got ridiculous, could be used in prestige classes. And just the system worked. That's probably the best thing about 3. 3.5 was completely unnecessary. Other than it was a land grab. It was a money grab. There was absolutely no reason for 3.5 to exist. It could have just been an errata, but instead they re-released an entire new game that we all bought without even thinking about it. Just la la la. And only you realize later, oh wow, I didn't really need to buy this. Then 4 comes along and oh God, was that just awful. I mean, like physical fights over 4. Like literally somebody tried to put a plastic bag over my head. Nothing that happened during 4 made sense. I mean, I understand people didn't like it. I understand that Wizards made every single solitary mistake they could make. It is a master class in how not to run a business. But nothing explains the hate. Nothing explains the violence. Nothing explains that there are still people out there who will go to war over 4E. So because 4E, I like this. I like the skill creep. I love the skill creep. The battlefield manipulation and control abilities, shifting. I really like that. It felt very tactical. It was a different game. It allowed us to do things we couldn't do in normal D&D because now we had this 3D tactical thing going on, with a lot of us liked. But then Pathfinder showed up and we're like, well, fuck this, let's play that. Pathfinder was D&D better. And Pathfinder initial, before it got weird with all the splat books, was perfect. It was perfect. It was 3.5 run through the rock tumbler to perfection. But then Paizo went insane and ruined it. But for like 2 years, there wasn't it was those moments where every character I could think up, I could make. They were all individual, even when we were all playing the same character. Pathfinder allowed us to be individual enough, because I remember playing in a all wizard game that we played for about half a year, and each one of us made a wizard built around a different style. And because of all the options Pathfinder gave you, we were all unique individuals, all with completely different spells, even though we were all playing wizards. Of course, I was playing a Red Wizard of Fae because they are my favorite D&D bad guys. And then 5 comes out. Well, D&D Next comes out, and we're playtesting D&D Next. And D&D Next, wow. I gotta tell you guys, D&D Next is so drastically different than printed 5. It's light and day. It's dark and day. Day and night. You know what? Light and day. So, yeah, we played D&D Next, and then we went through the second round of the playtest, which was like the 5e SRD. And then we got 5e, which is, my doggo, not the same game, but it was good. It was as close to home as 5e could get. The Mike Merle's 2014 to 2019 5e, yeah, it was perfect. Plus we had the OGL and the OSR and all these third-party games, and we had new people coming into the hobby. And yeah, 5e was perfect until Wizards pulled the veil and showed us what they really were. I don't know anything about 6e. I'm assuming it'll have mechanics I like and mechanics I don't like. Mechanically, 5e gave us advantage and disadvantage, which was just, oh my God, this makes so much sense, even if we got it wrong for the first couple months. And 5e gave us Mines of Fendelver, which is, the best thing Wizards of the Coast wrote for 5e. 5e gave us Tomb of Annihilation, which is the most Dungeons & Dragons adventure that was ever written for 5e. 5e gave us the OSR Wars. 5e gave us the Critical Role Wars. 5e gave us the death of D&D. D&D dies as we know it. Well, D&D was dead in 4th, because 4th was not D&D. 3.5 was the final D&D. And 5, even though it calls itself D&D and is closer to 3, it quickly becomes apparent that it's not Dungeons & Dragons. And at first, the differences are so minor, but then as time progresses and Wizards pulls away more and more from everything that was good about 2014 D&D, and then Critical Role happens, then just it's the fire started. And they're saying, D&D as you know it, Gygaxian D&D is dead. That's when we just start calling it Wizards of the Coast D20 level-based fantasy, right? And then we have all the ugliness over the past 4 years. Which brings us to today. Now, the last time I played 5e, which was about a year ago, I'm still playing the thing online. It was 2014 5e. And when we played through, Call of the Netherdeep, that's like playing 5e the way it was meant to be written. Played. The Call of the Netherdeep game I played was like everybody, well, except for one guy, would all sort of like agreed, we're playing it as it's written. We're playing it as it's supposed to be played. We're playing it with the understanding that we're in the world of Critical Role, and this is a very hyper-realized, almost superheroic Saturday morning cartoon take on level-based fantasy. So everything we did was a little bit more over the top, a little bit more superheroic. We pushed 5e because we all embraced 5e for what it was. And that's when 5e works. And the online game I'm in, it's 5e in name. And all the characters are based on 5e, but I'm playing a Minotaur Assassin. So really, how 5e is it? If somebody said, hey, Mike, run a 5e game, I'd sure be like, yeah, but I'm going to run it, 2014 Mines in Fendelver 5e. None of the ridiculous, no splat books. No D&D Beyond, just as we played it in 2014 when it was perfect. But if somebody just said, hey, I want to play D20 fantasy, what's the best out there? It's I mean, with so many fucking retro clones all trying to recapture that non-existent 80s. It's like, well, if you want to play D&D as it was in the 80s in every place else but California, Shadowdark. If you want to play D&D as it was in California, Dungeon Crawl Classic, or wait till the new Ardo and Grimoire role-playing game comes out in 2025. Because obviously, the Southern California, West Coast grognard, San Diego to Seattle style of play is completely different than the style of play everybody else seemed to have in the 80s. I talked to people who gamed here, and we talk about all the stuff people say of the way it was like in the 80s. And everybody I talked to who played in California, who played in Oregon, who played in Washington in the 80s were like, no, that's not what my experience was. I never experienced any of this. That wasn't how we played. Really, the West Coast grognard style that I played and everybody else I know played is the Dave Hargrave style, the Dungeon Crawl Classic style, the lots of random tables, the doesn't make sense, ridiculousness, Saturday morning cartoon Dungeons and Dragons. We had guys with lightsabers, and that was okay. So it's very difficult for me to tell you, which edition I want to play. Like if you were coming in right now, I'd say get the starter set that has Minds of Fendelver in it if you want to play D&D now. That's really all you need. It is the perfect starter set. It's the perfect starter adventure. You could probably play through Minds for a year with all the other side stuff and never have to worry about anything else. Now, if you came to me and said, well, I want to play D20 Fantasy, but I don't want to give Wizards of the Coast money, what are my choices? And I'd be like, again, well, if you want to play old school grimdark, mudcore, whatever you want to call it, Shadowdark. Shadowdark's your best bet. Even though it's too fucking expensive, Kelsey. And if you want to play West Coast grognard style, like I play, Dungeon Crawl Classic from Goodman Games is your best, because it's just ridiculous, but also it's a little too pricey. You could wait till Emperor's Choice comes out with Ardo and Grimoire 2025, because that'll probably be as close as you can get to the way I played in the 80s. But yeah, there's definitely games out there that emulate the dark, grim OSR style. That's 90% of the OSR. And then there are a few games that emulate the goofiness, that I played, and that's Dungeon Crawl Classics. That's the stuff that I'm writing with Postmortem. All my Goblin stuff is all trying to re-emulate that glorious 80s gaming style. So, I don't know, because, push comes to shove. If somebody says, well, what's your favorite edition? I'm going to be like Villains of Vigilante 2nd edition. Marvel Phase Rip. My favorite games aren't D&D. My favorite fantasy games aren't D&D. There are games that do D&D better. There are games that let me do what I want to do in D&D better. Pathfinder came closest because it was the first time where I felt like any idea I came up with, no matter how ridiculous or how by the book, I could play. Every character that I presented during the Pathfinder years worked in Pathfinder. I never felt that in 2nd edition. I had ideas that never really worked because 2nd edition just didn't have the mechanics or whatever, or maybe we just didn't have the mindset. I mean, part of the problem is people change. So what worked for you when you were 9 doesn't work for you when you're 19, and what works for you when you're 19 doesn't work for you when you were 49, because you've changed, and the game has changed, and the world has changed. And you're perceiving things about the game you didn't perceive yesterday, much less 10 years ago. So if you ask me today, best and worst of each edition, Well, you know what I'm going to say. It's like, Thaco, 3rd edition was probably best. Then Pathfinder was probably best. I think Pathfinder did D&D better than D&D. I think there are other third-party fantasy games out there that do D20 Gygaxian level-based better than D&D. Dungeons and Dragons. 5e is Wizards of the Coast D20 2014. It's not Dungeons and Dragons. I don't know what 6e is, but it's not Dungeons and Dragons. I don't know what Pathfinder 2nd edition is, but it's not Dungeons and Dragons. It's not Gygaxian level-based fantasy. But my, desert island fantasy game, I can only take one game with me to do fantasy. I'm not taking D&D. I'm taking the system that lets me do as many possible things as I can. So I'm looking at the shelf and I'm looking at, well, do I take Pathfinder? Or do I just take Chaosium's basic fantasy because it lets me do anything? Do I take Castles and Crusades? Or do I take, Adventures Unlimited, their other system, because that system does Castles and Crusades better than Castles and Crusades does? I'm taking that over Castles and Crusades. I'm taking basic role-playing from Chaosium over D&D, and I'm taking Villains and Vigilantes over any of the other superhero systems I have, because with those three, I can run anything. So, yeah, my favorite experience playing D&D was 2nd and early 3rd. My favorite edition of Dungeons and Dragons is Pathfinder, because it let me do everything I wanted to do. My all-time favorite D&D adventure is White Plume Mountain, because it's just so ridiculous. I love it. I think the best thing Wizards of the Coast has done for 5e is Mines. I think the best 5e product is Tomb of Annihilation. I think the best class to run in 5e is Cleric, followed by Tiefling Warlock, because Cleric in 5e is just broken. So yeah, there you go. And that brings our blabbing about my favorite editions to the end. I hope I maybe answered your questions, but really, I'm one voice amongst many. I'm just an idiot with a box trying to make the world a little better as I blather about role-playing. So just go out and play as many different games as you can in 2025. Find your own path. See ya.